Hello, come on in, get comfortable. Tonight we're going to spend some real time with someone who lived quite a life. She is a woman whose name you already know, but whose whole life you may not the two-dimensional figure from a costume drama. Not the one scandal everyone remembers, but the flesh and blood person who lived all of it in 35 or 36 years, and who is worth every one of the hours we're about to spend with her. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England for just over 1,000 days. Mother of perhaps the greatest monarch the country ever produced, and the reason the Church of England exists at all. That is a great deal for one short life to carry, and we're going to carry it with her, from the very beginning to the very end. It is the 1st of June, 1533. London lies under a low grey sky, the kind that holds its breath. The streets are hung with tapestries and cloth of gold, every window crammed with faces, the whole city turned out for a spectacle that has never been seen before and will never be repeated. From the Tower to Westminster Abbey, a procession stretches for half a mile horsemen, heralds, bishops, noblemen in crimson velvet, and at the centre of it all, on a litter draped in silver fabric, sits a woman in an ermine cloak, her dark hair loose over her shoulders, her head high. She is 32 years old, give or take, and she is about to become the Queen of England. Her name is Anne Boleyn. The litter rocks gently as it moves. She can feel the eyes of the crowd on her skin, but there is no sound. Not the roar you would expect for a coronation. No cheers, no blessings, no caps thrown in the air. Just a dense, unnerving quiet, broken here and there by a jeer or a muttered curse. Somebody laughs and points at the royal monogram stitched into the banners, a stylized H and A intertwined. Henry and Anne. The crowd has already turned it into a joke, a dirty pun, and the laughter that follows is not kind. Inside the abbey, the ancient stones swallow the noise. Thomas Cromwell, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, lowers the crown of St. Edward onto her head, a weight of cold gold, a ring of sacred duty. She is anointed, she is crowned, she is, in the eyes of the law and the new church, the legitimate queen. And yet, as she kneels there, the silence outside clings to the incense smoke like a question nobody will ask aloud. How did this woman get here? And why does nobody want to celebrate it? If you enjoy spending your nights with stories like this one, the whole unhurried arc of a life, a subscribe or a like goes a long way in helping the channel bring more of them to you. Now, let's go back to the beginning. How does a girl born into the minor nobility, with no great fortune and no royal blood, become the obsession of a king? What did she say to Henry VIII that planted the idea in his head that he, not the Pope, should rule the church in his own realm? Why did the people who line these streets refuse to cheer for her? And what turned that crown, in just 3 years, into a death sentence on a spring morning? Those are the questions that will carry us through the night. But first, we need to meet the child who started it all. Sometime around the turn of the 16th century, nobody wrote down the exact day, or even, it turns out, the exact year a girl was born to Thomas Boleyn and his wife, Elizabeth Howard. The year may have been 1501. It may have been 1507. Historians have argued about those 6 years for a very long time, and they have never settled it, which is a fitting way for this particular life to begin. A woman who would end up more closely examined than almost any other of her century, and we cannot even agree on how old she was. Thomas Boleyn was a man who understood that influence is something you build, brick by brick. His family had roots in trade, in the merchant guilds of Norfolk, but they had been climbing steadily into the gentry and the lower aristocracy for 2 or 3 generations. He himself was a diplomat, fluent in French, useful, ambitious, and trusted by Henry VII to carry messages across the Channel. Elizabeth Howard brought the real aristocratic weight to the marriage. She was the daughter of the Duke of Norfolk, one of the grandest titles in the land, from a family that had been near the top of English power since before anyone could remember. Together, they were the kind of couple who knew exactly how far they had come, and exactly how much further they intended to go. The family seat was Hever Castle in Kent, a compact, moated manor with thick stone walls and mullioned windows. Not a palace, not a showpiece, but solid and defensible and full of quiet ambition. Anne was the middle child of 3 who survived infancy. Her older sister, Mary, was a soft, pretty girl who would later drift into scandal without seeming to try very hard. And her younger brother, George, was bright and charming and doomed in ways that no one at Hever could yet imagine. The 3 of them grew up inside those stone walls, riding in the Kentish countryside, learning the rhythms of a household that was always preparing for the next leap forward. From the very beginning, Anne was treated as someone who would have to make her own way in the world, and that meant an education far beyond what most girls of her station received. She learned to read and write in English and French. She was taught arithmetic, music, probably some Latin. Her father, who had seen the courts of Europe and understood the value of a polished mind, made sure his younger daughter was shaped for a future outside England. The plan was never for her to stay home and marry a local knight and disappear into the Kentish fog. The plan was to send her into the great courts of the continent, where she could learn the arts of conversation, grace, and survival, and then bring all of that home to enhance the Boleyn name. That plan went into motion in the spring of 1513, when Anne was perhaps 12 years old. Thomas Boleyn, through his diplomatic channels, secured a place for her in the household of Margaret of Austria, the regent of the Low Countries. It was an extraordinary appointment for a girl of her rank, and it tells you how good her father was at his job. Margaret's court, in the town of Mechelen, was one of the most sophisticated in Europe, a centre of art, humanist learning, and refined manners. It was the perfect hothouse for a clever, observant girl who had already shown she could read a room and remember what she saw in it. And so, in the spring of 1513, a young Anne Boleyn said goodbye to the ducks on the moat at Hever and climbed into a carriage bound for the coast. She would not see England again for the better part of a decade. What she would become in those years, the polish, the wit, the quiet steel, was forged far from home, first in the candlelit chambers of a regent who ruled a patchwork of Burgundian lands, and later in the dazzling, dangerous court of France. The court of Margaret of Austria sat in Mechelen, a tidy, prosperous town in what is now Belgium. Margaret herself was a genuinely remarkable figure, twice widowed by the age of 24, a capable and clear-eyed ruler who governed the Low Countries on behalf of her nephew, the young man who would become the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. She had been raised partly in the French court. She collected illuminated manuscripts. She commissioned music. And she surrounded herself with the children of Europe's ambitious families, training them, without ever quite calling it training, in the art of being useful. Anne arrived there as one of 18 young filles d'honneur, girls from noble houses across the continent. They were not simply attendants. They were students in an unspoken academy of behaviour. They learned to dance the intricate bass dance, to play the lute and the virginals, to carry themselves through a formal banquet without ever once looking uncertain. They studied languages, French, some Italian, a little Latin. They learned how to write a letter that flattered without grovelling, how to read a face, how to listen more than they spoke. And they learned, above everything else, that a court is a stage on which every gesture is watched, weighed, and remembered. Anne drank it in. The evidence comes down to us in a single slip of paper, a letter Margaret wrote to Thomas Boleyn in the summer of 1514. She told him that his daughter was so well-mannered and so pleasant for her young age that she, the regent, felt more beholden to him for sending the girl than he could possibly be to her. For a busy ruler to take the time to write that, unprompted, about a 13-year-old who had been in her household for barely a year, that says something. Anne was not just blending in. She was standing out, and she was standing out in exactly the right way. The intellectual climate of Mechelen seeped into her as well. Margaret's court was steeped in the Christian humanism of Erasmus, who corresponded with the regent and admired her. He never taught Anne directly, but the air she breathed there carried a set of ideas that were quietly radical, that scripture should be read in one's own language, that the church could be cleansed and renewed from within, that faith was ultimately a private matter between a soul and God, with fewer priests standing in between than the Church of Rome preferred. Those seeds would lie dormant in her for a very long time, but they were planted in that Burgundian nursery, and they never died. In the autumn of 1514, Anne's life took another turn. Henry VIII's younger sister, another Mary Tudor, was being sent to France to marry the aging King Louis XII. It was a hard political match dressed up as a romance, and the princess needed a retinue of English ladies to accompany her across the Channel. Anne, already proficient in French and schooled in continental ways, was an obvious choice. She left Mechlin, joined Mary Tudor's train, and crossed into France for what everyone assumed would be a long and settled stay. It was neither. Louis XII was 52, gout-ridden, and determined to get an heir out of his teenage bride. He did not get one. Within 3 months of the wedding, he was dead. The story at the time, unkind and probably unfair, was that the effort of keeping up with his young wife had finished him off, and Mary Tudor, now a queen dowager at 18, was free to hurry home to England and marry the man she had actually wanted all along. But when the English party packed up and went home, Anne Boleyn did not go with them. Her father, ever the strategist, arranged for her to stay and enter the service of the new French Queen Claude, the gentle, pious wife of the dazzling young king, Francis I, and so began 7 years at the French court. 7 years that would remake Anne Boleyn entirely. Claude's household was quieter than Francis's glittering circle, but it was no backwater. The Queen was the daughter of Louis XII and Anne of Brittany, and she lived surrounded by the finest tapestry, the newest poetry, the most exquisite manners in Christendom. She was also, for most of the years Anne served her, either pregnant or recovering from being pregnant. Claude would bear 7 children in 9 years and die worn out at 24, and that meant her ladies ran a good deal of her life for her. Anne served her daily. She dressed her, accompanied her to Mass, read to her, and in the process absorbed the French language until it sat on her tongue as naturally as English. She learned to dress in the French style, with the elegant hood that curved back off the forehead to show the hair, a silhouette that would cause a small sensation when she eventually carried it home. She learned to converse with a dry wit, a playful intelligence that could entertain a king across a supper table without ever quite crossing the line into familiarity. She was not the only Boleyn girl at the French court. Her older sister, Mary, was there too, for a time, and Mary's French education went in a very different direction. Where Anne learned to hold a room at arm's length, Mary, by every account that survives, did not hold much of anything at arm's length. She became, briefly, one of the many young women who caught the eye of Francis I, a king with an appetite for such things, and very little discretion about it. Francis is supposed to have referred to Mary later with the coarseness of a man who felt no need to be careful, in terms no gentleman should use about anyone. Whether the affair was as extensive as the gossip claimed, we cannot know. What we can say is that Mary Boleyn left France with a reputation, and Anne Boleyn left France having watched, up close, exactly what happened to a woman who gave a king everything he asked for and kept nothing in reserve. The lesson did not need to be spelled out. Anne was a girl who learned from watching, and her own sister had just given her the clearest possible demonstration. The court of Francis I was a ferment of new ideas. Francis himself was a lavish patron of the arts, and, in his early years at least, relatively open to the currents of religious reform sweeping across the continent. His sister, Marguerite of Navarre, was a serious-minded woman who protected evangelical thinkers and corresponded with reformers all over Europe. Anne moved in the orbit of that circle. She read the French translation of the Bible. She acquired works by Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples, a French theologian who argued for salvation by faith alone and a return to the plain purity of the early church. She kept a small personal library, and those books travelled with her wherever she went for the rest of her life. They were not decoration. They were a framework for thinking about power, about the relationship between a monarch and God, about what a church was actually supposed to be and to whom it was supposed to answer. In the summer of 1520, when Anne was still in France, the two kings she would come to know, Francis of France and Henry of England, met at a field near Calais for 18 days of staggering, ruinous display that history remembers as the Field of Cloth of Gold. Temporary palaces of canvas and timber were painted to look like stone. Fountains ran with wine. There were tournaments, banquets, wrestling matches, and enough gold thread woven into enough fabric to bankrupt a small country. Anne, in the French Queen's household, was almost certainly somewhere in that vast encampment. Henry VIII was there too, at the height of his young magnificence, auburn-haired, athletic, 29 years old, wrestling with Francis in front of the whole nobility of two nations. It is one of history's small, strange knots that the man and the woman who would one day tear England away from Rome were probably in the same French meadow a dozen years before either of them had any idea, and that if they crossed paths at all, it meant nothing to either of them. She was a diplomat's daughter in a queen's train. He was a king. There was no reason on earth for him to notice her. All of it, the polish, the fashion, the theological curiosity, the sharp and careful tongue layered onto the natural intelligence she had brought from Hever. By the time she was 20, Anne Boleyn was unlike any English noblewoman of her generation. She carried herself with a confidence that could easily be mistaken for arrogance. She could discuss poetry and politics in the same breath. She understood from years of watching Francis maneuver that a king could be flattered, managed, even quietly influenced, but never, ever owned. And she had seen in the fate of discarded mistresses and fallen favourites, and her own sister, how quickly the sun could set on a woman who had made herself too available to the men who held the power. In 1521, the chessboard shifted again. War between England and France was heating up, and Thomas Boleyn, by now the English ambassador in Paris, decided it was time to bring his younger daughter home. Anne packed her French gowns, her books, her lute, and a decade of hard-won continental education, and boarded a ship for England. She had left as a clever child of 12. She returned as a young woman who had been raised in the two most refined courts in Europe, fluent in French, steeped in reformist thought, and equipped with a set of social weapons that nobody in the somewhat provincial English court had ever seen deployed before. She was about to walk into a room where a bored, frustrated king was already, without quite knowing it, searching for something for someone he had not yet found. The ship that brought Anne Boleyn back to England in the winter of 1522 docked at Dover on a grey afternoon, the kind where the sea and the sky blur into one indifferent wash. She stepped onto the stone quay wrapped in French wool, her luggage heavy with gowns and books, her head full of 10 years of continental music and conversation. The air smelled of salt and wood smoke, and underneath that, the particular mustiness of a country that had not yet caught up to the places she had been. She was coming home, but she was not the same person who had left. That girl had been a bright, promising child from a family on the make. This young woman, somewhere around 21, carried herself like someone who had been educated in the two most refined courts in Europe and was entirely aware of it. Every gesture, every inflection, every tilt of her chin announced that she was no longer quite English and that she had no particular intention of becoming so again. Her father had not summoned her back out of sentiment. Thomas Boleyn was in the middle of negotiating a marriage alliance that would tie his family more tightly to the Irish earldom of Ormond, a title he had been angling after for years through his mother's side. The plan was straightforward. Marry Anne to her Irish cousin, James Butler, settle a long-running inheritance dispute, and fold the Ormond lands and prestige neatly into the Boleyn line. Anne was the chess piece, and Thomas was moving her into position. She had not been consulted, of course, because daughters of ambitious courtiers were never consulted, but she understood the game as well as her father did. She had spent 7 years watching the marriage market operate at the very highest levels of European power. She knew that a woman's value was measured in titles and acreage, and that love was a luxury you grabbed on the side, quietly, if you were lucky and careful. She unpacked her trunks at Hever, greeted her mother and her siblings, and prepared to play the role she had been assigned. Before any betrothal could be formalised, however, Anne was to be presented at the English court. Her father wanted her seen. He wanted her to make an impression. He wanted the king and his advisors to register that Thomas Boleyn had brought home a genuinely polished asset. And so, in March of 1522, Anne Boleyn made her debut in the most public way imaginable. She stepped onto a stage at York Place, in front of the whole court, dressed in embroidered white satin, and performed in a lavish allegorical entertainment called the Chateau Vert, the Green Castle. It was exactly the kind of thing Henry VIII adored, full of costumes and music and mock combat, in which 8 ladies representing the feminine virtues defended a castle against a siege by 8 lords representing masculine ardour. The whole thing settled, inevitably, by a shower of sweetmeats and comfits thrown across the hall. Anne played the role of perseverance, her sister Mary played kindness, and Henry himself, inevitably, led the besiegers, in disguise, as though anyone in that room could fail to recognise the largest, loudest, most magnificently dressed man in England. The hall was lit by torches and candles that threw dancing shadows across the tapestries. Anne moved through the choreography with a natural grace that made the English ladies around her look stiff and homemade by comparison. She sang, she danced, she delivered her lines in an accent that was English by birth, but French by long habit. The court had never seen anything quite like her, and they were not at all sure they liked it. A Venetian ambassador, a man whose entire profession was to watch and to report accurately, described Anne some years later as not one of the handsomest women in the world. But he noted that she had something more dangerous than conventional beauty. She had presence. Her skin was olive, almost swarthy by the fashion of the day. Her hair was black and thick and long, her eyes dark and unusually expressive, and she knew precisely what to do with all of it. The English ideal of the moment was blonde, pale and rosy. Anne was none of those things. She was striking, magnetic, and just a little foreign, and she dressed in that French style, with a hood set back to show her hair, a silhouette that whispered of a wider, brighter world the English court was desperate to imitate and quietly resentful of. She was appointed a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, which was a perfectly respectable position for the daughter of a rising diplomat. Catherine's household was a quiet, deeply pious place, organised around the Queen's daily rounds of prayer, needlework, and charitable works. The Queen herself was a woman of formidable dignity, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, a survivor of widowhood and years of political isolation and near poverty in her first youth in England. She had been married to Henry for over a decade, and in that time she had been pregnant at least 6 times. Only one child, a daughter named Mary, had lived. The rest stillbirths, miscarriages, infants who breathed for a few hours or a few weeks and then simply stopped, were buried in small graves around the realm. Catherine bore all of it with the rigid composure of a woman who believed, absolutely and without flinching, that her suffering was part of God's plan and not to be questioned. Anne watched her. She watched how the Queen moved through the court, how she managed the king's moods, how she wielded a kind of moral authority without ever once raising her voice. Anne was learning, though she could not yet have said what she was learning it for. It was during this period, somewhere around 1523, that Anne fell into something that looked a great deal like actual love. The object was Henry Percy, the heir to the earldom of Northumberland, a young man with a gentle manner and one of the greatest inheritances in the north of England waiting for him. He was often at court, part of the crowd of young noblemen who served in the household of Cardinal Wolsey, the king's chief minister, and he and Anne kept finding reasons to be in the same rooms. They talked, they danced, they exchanged the kind of glances that, at a court where absolutely everything was observed, amounted to a public announcement. And then, without asking anyone's permission, they made a promise to each other, a secret betrothal. And a betrothal in the eyes of the church was no small thing. A properly witnessed promise, followed by consummation, was as binding as a marriage. Whether the two of them went that far is something no living person will ever know. but the commitment was real enough that Percy began to behave as though Anne were already, in some sense, his wife. The news reached Cardinal Wolsey within days. Everything reached Wolsey within days, and his reaction was swift and brutal. Percy was already promised to another woman, Mary Talbot, the daughter of the Earl of Shrewsbury, in a match that Wolsey himself had helped to arrange. The cardinal had no intention of letting a great northern heir throw away a carefully built alliance for the sake of a dark-eyed girl from the Boleyn family, a family the cardinal regarded, with some justice, as ambitious upstarts. He summoned Percy to his presence, and in front of a room full of witnesses, tore into him. He called him a foolish boy. He told him that the king had other purposes in mind for Anne, though what those purposes were, nobody at that point could have said, and that Percy was to forget her at once and marry the woman he had been given. Percy, young and frightened of the cardinal in the way that everyone under Wolsey was frightened of the cardinal, crumpled. He went home. He married Mary Talbot in what would become one of the coldest and most miserable unions in the entire English nobility, and he never spoke to Anne Boleyn again. Anne herself was sent away from court, back to Hever, in what amounted to an internal exile. She had been publicly discarded, humiliated, reminded in the cruelest possible way that her own feelings counted for precisely nothing in the machinery of aristocratic marriage. The weeks she spent walking the familiar paths by the moat, sitting in the rooms where she had been a child, were a kind of dark education. She did not weep, and she did not rage, or if she did, no record of it survives. What survived was a cold, clear understanding that would shape everything that came after. Emotions were a liability. Trust was a trap. The only person who was ever going to protect Anne Boleyn was Anne Boleyn. And the cardinal, the man who had humiliated her, who had swept her off the board like a nuisance, she did not forget him. That grudge settled into her chest like a stone and sat there, growing heavier year by year, until the day came when she could finally use it. The marriage to James Butler, meanwhile, collapsed in the slow, bureaucratic way that diplomatic failures tend to. The legal and financial complications were never quite resolved, and both sides eventually stopped pretending the match would ever happen. So Anne was free of it, free of the Irish entanglement, free of the expectation that she would marry some titled cousin and vanish quietly into the countryside. She came back to court, reinstated among Catherine's ladies, but she was not the girl who had danced in the Green Castle. She was warier now, sharper, far less willing to charm anyone for the simple pleasure of charming them. She had learned to keep her real thoughts behind a screen of wit, and she had learned that the people who hold power will use you unless you learn, first, to make yourself useful to them on your own terms. And then, sometime around 1525 or 1526, the king began to notice her. It did not happen all at once. Henry VIII in his middle 30s was still a magnificent figure, tall, broad through the shoulders, athletic, auburn-haired, with the easy, bottomless confidence of a man who had been told from the cradle that he was the handsomest prince in Christendom, and who had not yet been given a serious reason to doubt it. He hunted, he jousted, he composed music that was genuinely rather good. He debated theology with his chaplains for sport, and he conducted his love affairs with the light discretion of a man who did not believe the ordinary rules were written with him in mind. For several years his principal mistress had been a gentle, fair girl named Elizabeth Blount, who had given him the one thing Catherine could not, a healthy son. That boy, Henry Fitzroy, was living, breathing proof that the king's failure to produce a legitimate male heir was not the king's fault. It was, the king had decided, Catherine's. And Catherine, now past 40, was not going to conceive again. Henry had, in his way, made a rough peace with all of that, or told himself he had. He had a daughter, he had an illegitimate son he was fond of, and had loaded with titles. He had wars and treaties and building projects to fill his days. But underneath all the activity ran a thin, constant thread of dread. A king without a legitimate son was a king whose whole life's work could unravel the moment he closed his eyes, and Henry knew it, and it gnawed at him in the dark. He did not need a philosopher to tell him what a disputed succession did to a kingdom. His own grandfather had won the throne on a battlefield, precisely because the previous century had run out of clear heirs. That was not ancient history to Henry. That was the family business. When his attention first landed on Anne, it was probably nothing more complicated than attraction. She was different, unreadable, a genuine puzzle in a court where nearly everyone else was transparent to him. She spoke French with a real Parisian lilt. She could hold up her end of a conversation about poetry or music or scripture. She had opinions, and she was not afraid to express them to his face, and she did not blush and simper and dissolve when the King of England spoke to her. She answered him with a dry, almost challenging wit that nobody else at court would have dared to use on him, and she did not, crucially, seem especially interested in winning his favour. That, more than the dark eyes or the French gowns, is what drew him in. Henry had spent his whole life being pursued. Here, at last, was someone who appeared to be walking the other way. By the spring of 1527, the King of England was writing her love letters. 17 of them survive housed today, by a strange twist, in the Vatican Library. Of all places, the very institution Henry would soon defy, and they are remarkable documents, intimate, pleading, at moments almost adolescent in their raw need. He wrote to her in French, their private language. He complained that he had been more than a year struck by the dart of love, and was still not certain whether he had a place in her heart. He begged her to write back, to give him some sign, to declare herself his and his alone, body and soul. And Anne wrote back. Her side of the correspondence is lost. She was far too careful to keep his, but we can reconstruct its shape from his replies. She was warm but guarded. She accepted his devotion without ever quite returning it in the terms he wanted. She drew a line, a firm and unmistakable line, and then she held it, month after month, while the most powerful man in England beat himself against it. She would not become his mistress. This was not prudishness, and it would be a mistake to read it as maidenly modesty. Anne had watched her own sister, Mary, become the king's mistress a few years earlier for by now Mary Boleyn, home from France and married off to a pleasant, unremarkable courtier named William Carey, had caught Henry's eye in her turn, and had a quiet affair with him that lasted a year or two. Mary bore 2 children during those years, Catherine and Henry Carey, and there were whispers at court, never proven and never quite silenced, that one or both of them were the king's. Henry never acknowledged them. That was the whole point, and Anne saw it clearly. Her sister had given the king everything, asked for nothing, and received exactly that in return, nothing. Mary had been enjoyed, then set gently aside, married deeper into obscurity, and forgotten by everyone except the gossips. Anne had watched that entire arc from a few feet away. She had also spent her formative years at the French court, where royal mistresses could wield real, glittering power for a while, and then they were replaced, pensioned off, or eased into a convent, and the glitter went to whoever came next. So Anne made a calculation that no other woman in her position had ever quite dared to make. She told Henry in words that have been paraphrased down the centuries but never confirmed by any surviving letter that she would rather lose her life than her honour. She would give him her heart, her loyalty, her company, her conversation, but she would not give him her body, not as a mistress, not unless and until she could give it to him as his lawful wife. On its face, that demand was absurd, and she knew it was absurd. A king of England did not marry a knight's daughter. He married a foreign princess whose bloodline and dowry brought him alliances and territory and the goodwill of other crowns. Catherine herself was the daughter of 2 reigning monarchs. Anne was the daughter of a diplomat and a Howard girl. The gap between them was, by every rule anyone lived by, simply unbridgeable. And yet, by the time Anne made her position plain, something had already begun to move in Henry's mind, something that had very little to do with her and everything to do with his own tormented conscience. He had convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine was cursed. There was a verse in the book of Leviticus that had lodged in him and would not come loose. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it said, it is an unclean thing, and they shall be childless. Catherine had been married first to Henry's older brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales, who had died a few months after their wedding, when they were both barely more than children. Catherine had sworn, then and ever after, that the marriage had never been consummated, that she had come to Henry's bed a virgin, and for years Henry had believed her or had not thought about it. But now, staring at the row of dead infants and the single surviving daughter and the empty cradle, he had stopped believing her. He looked at all that loss, and he saw the hand of an angry God punishing him for a marriage that had been sinful from the start. Anne did not create that conviction, but she gave it a shape, and she gave Henry a reason, and a language, and a direction to point it in. Somewhere around 1528, she pressed a book into his hands. It was a dangerous book to be holding, The Obedience of a Christian Man, by William Tyndale, a reformist theologian whose English translation of the New Testament was banned in England as heresy, hunted down and burned wherever the authorities could find it. Tyndale argued that kings derived their authority directly from God and from no one else, that the church in each realm should answer to its own anointed monarch and not to a bishop in a distant Italian city, and that a king who bent his knee to a foreign pope was no true king at all. Anne had read it closely. She had marked certain passages. She handed it to Henry and told him, in effect, that this was a book every king ought to read. He read it, and the idea took root in exactly the soil that had been prepared for it. What followed consumed years, and it swallowed up men far more powerful than Anne Boleyn. Contemporaries called it, with a kind of exhausted grandeur, the king's great matter. The strategy, at first, was legal and narrow. Henry would argue that the original papal dispensation that had allowed him to marry his brother's widow had been invalid from the beginning, because the biblical prohibition against it was absolute, beyond even the Pope's power to set aside. If the dispensation was worthless, the marriage was worthless, and the king was, and always had been, a single man. Cardinal Wolsey, as both papal legate and the king's chief minister, was handed the job of making that argument stick. It did not stick. Pope Clement VII was caught in a vice not of his own making. He was, at that precise moment, effectively the prisoner of the Emperor Charles V, Catherine of Aragon's own nephew, whose mutinous armies had sacked Rome itself in 1527, leaving the Pope to negotiate for his life. Granting Henry an annulment meant publicly humiliating the emperor by declaring his aunt a woman who had been living in sin for 20 years and inviting God only knew what further chaos. Refusing it meant angering the King of England, who, for all his loud piety, was beginning to show a temper that could redraw the religious map of a continent. So Clement did what popes under pressure have always done. He stalled. He appointed commissions. He dispatched legates who travelled slowly and deliberated slowlier. He suggested, ever so reasonably, that perhaps the whole unpleasant business could be resolved if Henry simply accepted that his marriage was valid and stopped asking about it. Henry did not stop asking, and Anne, through all of it, was at his side. She appeared with him now at banquets and hunting parties, seated not in the shadows but in the place of honour that belonged, by right, to the Queen. She received ambassadors, she discussed policy, she offered opinions and was listened to. The French ambassador reported home, more than once, that Anne was effectively the Queen in all but name, that the King spent far more time in her company than in Catherine's, and that she had become the person through whom favours and appointments and access to the royal ear all flowed. She was, by the late 1520s, a political figure in her own right, and she used that position deliberately to push the cause that mattered to her. She championed a quiet Cambridge scholar named Thomas Cromwell, who had made the shrewd suggestion that Henry should stop waiting on Rome and instead put the theological question to the great universities of Europe. She supported the smuggling and distribution of English Bibles. She began, patiently, to build a network of allies who shared her vision of a church answerable to the Crown of England rather than to the See of Rome. And all the while, she held the line. She was still not his mistress. The chase that had begun as a king's idle pursuit had become the defining obsession of his life. He had staked his authority, his dynasty, and his very soul on this one woman, and she was, still, technically, out of his reach. That unreachability was her power, and all three of them, Henry, Anne, and the entire watching court, understood it perfectly. The first great man to be crushed under the weight of the stalemate was Wolsey himself. By 1529, after years of fruitless negotiation, the cardinal had failed to deliver the one thing the king wanted. A special court convened at Blackfriars in London, with Wolsey and a visiting cardinal from Rome sitting in judgment, and it collapsed in a moment of extraordinary theatre when Catherine, refusing to accept the court's authority, crossed the floor, knelt at Henry's feet in front of everyone, and swore on her immortal soul that she had come to him a true maid. Then she rose and walked out, and would not come back no matter how many times her name was called. The case was revoked to Rome, where everyone understood it would now die quietly of old age. Wolsey was finished. Anne's hand was in the aftermath, though she was careful to keep it well out of sight. She had never forgiven the cardinal for the destruction of her engagement to Percy, and now she watched, with a satisfaction she did not bother to hide from her intimates, as the king stripped Wolsey of his offices, his staggering wealth, and his great palace of Hampton Court, which Henry simply took for himself. Wolsey was arrested on a charge of treason in the autumn of 1530 and died on the road south at Leicester Abbey, an old and broken man before he could ever be brought to trial. A convenient death, some said. A mercy, said others. Anne said nothing at all in public, but she did not mourn. The path to the throne was clearing, but it was still blocked by the great immovable rock of Rome and by the woman herself. The Pope would not yield. Catherine would not yield, and Anne, now moving through her late 20s, was running short of the one commodity a woman in her exact position could not afford to waste: time. The months after Wolsey's death were strange and suspended, like a long-held breath. Anne had won a victory. The man who had humiliated her was dead, his fortune swallowed by the crown, his palaces stripped. But the larger prize, the marriage and the crown themselves, still hung just out of reach. The Pope refused to move. Catherine refused to retreat into a nunnery, which would have solved everything, and which she rejected with total contempt every time it was suggested. And Anne watched the years slide past, without a ring on her finger or a child in her arms. She did not waste the waiting. She spent it building. She had, by this point, become perhaps the single most effective distributor of banned evangelical books in England. Forbidden texts, English scriptures, reformist tracts, the sort of thing that could get a printer burned found their way into her hands through sympathetic merchants and clergy, arriving hidden in bales of cloth and barrels of Rhenish wine off the boats from Antwerp, and from her hands they travelled outward, to courtiers, to scholars, to bishops she thought might be persuadable, to anyone she judged useful in shifting the ground beneath the English Church. She was not merely a patroness of reform who liked the idea of it. She was a working part of the machine, a node in a network that ran from the printing presses of the Low Countries to the candlelit studies of Cambridge, and she took real personal risk to keep it running. Thomas Cromwell she brought closer still. He had impressed the king with that clever suggestion about the universities, and Anne saw its brilliance at once. It was a way to build an overwhelming pile of scholarly opinion in Henry's favour without ever once asking Rome for permission. She made sure Henry kept listening to him. Cranmer was dispatched to the continent with a commission to canvass the faculties of theology, Paris, Orleans, Bologna, Ferrara, and to come home with their verdicts on the question consuming England. Opinion after opinion came back favourable to the king. Some of them, it must be said, encouraged by English money changing hands quietly in the right rooms. Cranmer returned not as a humble Cambridge don, but as a man plainly marked for the very highest office the English Church could offer. Her father, now raised to Earl of Wiltshire, and her brother George, now Viscount Rochford, rose alongside her, a whole family ascending together on the strength of one woman's hold over the king. The old nobility, the Howards and the Staffords and the rest, watched the Boleyns climb with a mixture of envy and real alarm. A knight's granddaughter was outmaneuvering the lot of them, and they knew it, and they did not forgive it. Her wardrobe became a kind of argument. French gowns of velvet and cloth of silver, jewels that outshone the Queen's, worn deliberately in the Queen's presence. Her hood, that distinctive French crescent set back off the brow, was a pointed contrast to the heavy, old-fashioned English gable hood that Catherine and her loyal ladies still wore. It was as though Anne was dressing every day for a role she had not yet been given, and quietly daring anyone in the room to tell her to stop. Her relationship with Catherine had curdled by now into something openly poisonous. The two women existed in the same court, sometimes under the same roof, and the tension was almost unbearable to be near. Catherine, with her unbending dignity, refused to treat Anne as anything but a lady-in-waiting who had disgracefully forgotten her place. And Anne, for her part, could be genuinely cruel. She was overheard, in a moment of frustration that was widely reported and did her no good at all, to wish that all the Spaniards in the world were at the bottom of the sea. It was the kind of thing a woman could say only if she was absolutely certain of the king's protection. Anne was that certain. It did not make her one friend. Beneath all of it, a new fault line was opening, one that would in the end prove far more dangerous to Anne than her feud with a discarded queen. Thomas Cromwell had risen out of the wreckage of Wolsey's fall. He was a self-made man in a world that despised self-made men, the son of a Putney blacksmith and brewer, who had knocked around Europe as a soldier and a merchant and a moneylender, before teaching himself law and clawing his way into royal service. He was brilliant, tireless, methodical, and entirely without illusions. In the early years of the Great Matter, Cromwell and Anne had been allies. They wanted the same immediate thing, the break with Rome, the creation of a sovereign English state that answered to no external authority, and they worked together to bring it about. But their visions parted on one enormous question, and the question was money. Cromwell was preparing, in his methodical way, for the dissolution of the monasteries, the greatest transfer of wealth England would see between the Norman conquest and the modern age. He looked at the vast lands and treasuries of the religious houses, and he saw a war chest, a fortune that could refill the king's chronically empty coffers, fund a navy, and buy the loyalty of the nobility for a generation. Anne looked at the very same wealth and saw something else entirely. She agreed the monasteries were often corrupt and in need of reform, but she believed their riches should be redirected into education, into poor relief, into new bishoprics and new scholarships, into the building of a reformed church that actually served the people it collected from. She called Cromwell, more than once and not always privately, a man of low birth who did not understand the obligations of Christian charity. He called her, in his own private rooms, a dangerous meddler who would ruin the whole design if someone did not stop her. They were each, as it happened, quite right about the other, and they both knew it. In the autumn of 1532, after years of grinding stalemate, everything suddenly accelerated. Henry decided to take Anne across to Calais, the last English foothold on the French coast, for a face-to-face summit with King Francis I. On the surface, it was diplomacy. Henry needed French support, or at least French neutrality, against the Pope and the Emperor. But it was also a debut. Anne travelled as though she were already the Queen. She was lodged in the finest apartments. She dined with Francis, danced at his entertainments, received his gifts. The French king, who had known her years before only as a lady-in-waiting to his own wife, now treated her as a royal consort. For Anne, that trip must have felt like a homecoming and a vindication braided together into one. Something else happened in Calais, something private and enormous in its consequences. For roughly 6 years, Anne and Henry had maintained their chaste, maddening arrangement, an almost unbelievable feat of patience on both sides. But in Calais, with the French court treating her as a queen, and the annulment still frozen in Rome, the calculation finally shifted. They slept together, and Anne became pregnant almost at once, a fact that would make itself known within a few weeks of their return to England. The physical barrier she had held for so long, held through every temptation and every royal tantrum, came down at last in those French apartments, with the channel between her and the disapproving eyes of home. The pregnancy changed everything, because it put a clock on everything. 6 years of waiting, negotiating, and theological argument suddenly had a hard deadline written on it, in a way that could not be argued with. The child growing inside her had to be born legitimate. It had to be born a prince or a princess of England, not a bastard whose claim anyone could someday challenge. And so Henry moved now with the speed of a man who had been handed, all at once, a second chance at every single thing he wanted. On the 25th of January, 1533, in the early hours of the morning, in a private chamber high in one of the royal palaces, Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn were quietly married. The ceremony was secret, attended by only a handful of witnesses who were sworn hard to silence. Anne was pregnant by perhaps a few weeks. The small, secret swell of her belly was the reason for all the haste, and it was, for now, their own. For the next several months, the secret held. In May of 1533, Cranmer, freshly installed as Archbishop of Canterbury, convened his own church court at Dunstable Priory. Catherine was summoned. Catherine, as everyone knew she would, refused to appear, maintaining to the very end that she was the one true queen, and that no court in England had any authority over her marriage. Cranmer proceeded without her, and issued the ruling that Henry had been chasing for 7 exhausting years. The marriage to Catherine of Aragon was declared null and void, invalid from the day it was made, and Anne's marriage to Henry, therefore, was lawful. She was the queen. The announcement sent a shockwave through England and across Europe. The Pope threatened excommunication. The Emperor raged. But Henry, for the first time in years, did not care what either of them thought, because he finally had what he wanted, and he ordered a coronation on a scale the country had never seen. No expense was spared. Cloth of gold, triumphal arches, a whole fleet of barges. The date was set for the 1st of June, when Anne would be crowned at Westminster Abbey, visibly and proudly pregnant with the heir that everyone, assumed would be a boy. The festivities ran for 4 days, and they were designed as a single, enormous argument, made in gold and pageantry, that this marriage was legitimate and this queen was to be loved. On the 29th of May, the city companies brought Anne up the Thames from Greenwich in a procession of decorated barges, bells ringing, guns firing from the ships, one barge carrying an enormous mechanical dragon that belched fire and smoke into the river air, while wild men capered around it throwing flames. At the very front went a barge bearing Anne's own emblem, chosen and displayed for the first time in full public splendour, a white-crowned falcon, standing on a golden tree stump from which fresh red and white roses sprang, the dead Tudor stump bursting back into bloom because of her. It was a clever, pointed image. The white falcon had been a badge of her Butler and Ormond ancestors, so it staked her ancient lineage, and the roses growing from the old stump promised exactly what Anne was there to deliver: new life for the dynasty, an heir, a future. Her motto was displayed alongside it, in plain English rather than courtly French: the most happy. That was the badge, and that was the claim. The next day she came through the city itself, from the Tower to Westminster, along streets that had been swept clean and hung with tapestry, past fountains that ran with wine, past elaborate pageants staged at every major crossing. At Cornhill she was met by tableaus of the Three Graces. At the little conduit in Cheapside, a mechanical white falcon descended and was crowned by an angel, while verses were recited comparing Anne to the mother of the coming Tudor son. Enormous care and enormous money had gone into every one of these displays. Humanist scholars had written the speeches, and the chroniclers who were there noted, with a certain awkwardness, that the elaborate pageants were received by the watching crowds in a heavy, resentful silence. The people of London had loved Catherine of Aragon for more than 20 years. They saw her as a wronged and pious woman, cast aside in her middle age for a dark-eyed girl half her age, and no amount of fire-breathing river dragons was going to change their minds about it. The wine ran, the falcon was crowned, and the crowds for the most part kept their caps on their heads and their blessings in their mouths. On the morning of the 1st of June, then, the city of London woke to the sound of church bells and the tramp of hooves, and we come back around at last to the scene where we began this story. The thin grey light, the swept streets, the half-mile of procession winding out from the Tower of London. Now we can stand inside it. Anne rode in a litter of white satin, draped in cloth of silver that shimmered even under that muted sun. Her gown was purple velvet over an underskirt of silver tissue, and her dark hair fell loose over her shoulders, the sign of a bride on the edge of a sacred duty. An ermine cloak covered her. Above her head, a canopy of cloth of gold was carried by 4 men who walked with the slow, careful gait of people who understood that a single stumble would be remembered for years. Around her rode the whole apparatus of the realm, the foreign merchants, the gentlemen, the newly created knights of the Bath in their fresh robes, the bishops, the great officers of state carrying the swords and sceptres of England, and the crowds pressed against the barriers. Thousands of faces turned toward her, and they were silent. Not the hush of awe. Something harder and colder than that. Here and there a voice called out a blessing, but the sound died in the general quiet. And somewhere in the press, a knot of men caught sight of that intertwined H and A stitched into the banners overhead, and began to laugh, and to turn the 2 letters into a crude joke, and the laughter rippled outward through the crowd. Anne could hear it. She kept her chin lifted and her eyes on the middle distance, and she did not flinch, because whatever else this morning was, it was the thing she had spent 7 years, and every ounce of her considerable nerve, to reach. Inside Westminster Abbey the world changed again. The silence there was a different silence, thick with incense, ancient, holy. Anne processed the long nave with her train carried behind her, knelt on the cold stone before the high altar, and let Thomas Cranmer anoint her with holy oil, and set upon her head the heavy crown of St. Edward the Confessor, and then a second, lighter crown made especially for her. The choir sang the great hymn of praise, and for one long moment she simply knelt there under the weight of the gold, a knight's daughter from a moated house in Kent, anointed Queen of England in the same abbey where every English queen had been crowned since the Conquest. She had done it, every bit of it, and Henry watched the whole thing from a curtained gallery high above the floor, hidden from view, a king who had broken with 1,000 years of Rome for this one woman, and who was certain, absolutely certain, that she was carrying his son. After the coronation, Anne settled into the rhythms of queenship at Greenwich. Her household was established on a grand scale, filled with ladies and gentlemen, chaplains and musicians. She hung her apartments with rich tapestries and filled them with the books she had been collecting since her girlhood in France. Her personal library was remarkable for a woman of her time and place. French Bibles, evangelical tracts, works of humanist scholarship, several of them technically illegal to own. She was, without much competition, one of the most intellectually engaged consorts England had ever had, and she made sure that her court looked like it. The pregnancy advanced through the summer. Astrologers and physicians lined up to assure the king, with total confidence, that the child would be a prince. Henry ordered a magnificent tournament to be held the moment the boy was born. A gilded cradle stood ready and waiting. Letters announcing the birth to the courts of Europe were written out in advance, with the word prince already inked into the sentence, needing only a date. There was no second version. Nobody thought a second version would be necessary. On the 7th of September, 1533, in a chamber at Greenwich hung with tapestries depicting the life of a saint, Anne went into labour. The birth was straightforward, and the child was healthy and strong, and when the cry rang out, the word that came with it was not the word everyone in England had spent 9 months preparing. You are lying in a great curtained bed, exhausted and triumphant, and you have just done the one thing you were brought here to do. You have carried a child to term and delivered it alive, which is more than the woman you replaced managed in 20 years of trying. You are waiting to hear the single syllable that will make you untouchable forever. And the word, when it comes, is the wrong one. It is a girl, a perfect, red-haired, furious girl. You hold her, and you feel her weight, And somewhere in the next room you can hear that the tournament is already being quietly cancelled, and you understand, even now, even in this first hour, that you have not finished the job. You have only bought yourself time to do it again. Anne named the girl Elizabeth, after Henry's own mother, Elizabeth of York, whose marriage had ended the long civil wars and joined the warring houses into one. It was a name loaded with meaning, a name that said this child belonged at the very centre of the Tudor project. But Henry, standing in the doorway or pacing in the room beyond, could not keep the disappointment off his face. He had gambled a kingdom and his soul on the certainty that God would give him a son, and God had given him a daughter. He did not rage, he did not weep, he set his jaw, and he cancelled the great tournament, and the pre-written letters were hastily corrected, the word prince scratched out, and princess squeezed in above it in a different hand. Anne took a different lesson from that cradle than Henry did. She looked at the girl and saw, not a failure, but an inheritance worth defending. She insisted, to the open scandal of the court, on nursing Elizabeth herself for as long as she was permitted. Queens did not do that. That was what wet nurses were for, and she fought Henry over the details of the child's household, demanding more staff, better rooms, more visits. When Elizabeth was eventually established at Hatfield, the traditional nursery palace for royal children, Anne travelled there whenever she could, bringing caps and gowns she had chosen or embroidered herself, and spending hours in the nursery. Whatever else was true about Anne Boleyn, and a great deal that was not kind, was true. She was determined that this particular daughter would grow up certain that she was wanted. But the pressure was already gathering again behind her. The country had celebrated a coronation and a christening. What Henry needed, with something close to physical hunger, was a son, and the silence of the crowd on that June morning had been a warning, and the cancelled tournament was another. A queen who could not give the king a boy was a queen living on time she had not yet earned. In the autumn of 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, and with it, quietly, on a page of dry legal English, the country changed its foundations. The wording was blunt. The king was declared the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. Every subject of the realm, from the greatest duke down to the poorest tenant farmer, could be required to swear an oath acknowledging this new order of things. To refuse the oath was treason. Treason meant death. What had started as one man's argument about one marriage had become the settled law of the land, and there was no longer any road back to Rome that did not run through a great deal of blood. Anne did not receive this as a spectator. She had helped to build the intellectual scaffolding that made it possible the smuggled books, the promoted scholars, the careful, patient argument that a king answered to God alone. And now that the thing was law, she moved to press her advantage in the one arena where a queen could genuinely shape a church, the appointment of its bishops. When a see fell vacant, Anne's voice was in the king's ear, and the men she pushed forward were reformers. There is a bishop named Hugh Latimer worth pausing on here, because he shows you the kind of man Anne wanted in a pulpit. Latimer was a plain-spoken, fearless preacher from the Midlands who thundered against purgatory and the cult of saints and the selling of holy relics, and who was, at that point in his career, exactly the sort of person a cautious court kept at arm's length. Anne did not keep him at arm's length. She brought him to preach before her. She protected him when the Conservatives came after him for heresy, and when the Diocese of Worcester came open. She saw to it that Latimer was the man who got it, which handed a fiery evangelical, a great cathedral, and a vast stretch of the English countryside to preach across. She did that more than once, for more than one man. She was not suggesting names off a list. She was choosing the people who would shape what English men and women heard from the pulpit on a Sunday, and she was choosing them on purpose. At the same time, she made herself the most important patron the English Bible had. Printed scriptures in English, still officially banned, still arriving hidden in the holds of ships, came into her hands and radiated out again. She kept a great English Bible open on a stand in her own chambers, available to her ladies and to any curious visitor, and the message of that open book in that room was unmistakable. The Word of God belonged to whoever could read it, not only to the priests, and the Queen of England would personally guarantee that it stayed within reach. Her charity in these years was extraordinary even by the standards of a role that demanded public generosity as a matter of course. The clerks who kept her accounts were startled by the sheer volume of it. Food and clothing went out every day to the poor who gathered at the palace gates. She funded students at Cambridge. She interceded with the king for prisoners and debtors and widows. Some of this was theatre. Of course, a queen was supposed to be a merciful intercessor, and Anne knew her lines. But the daily grind of it, the sheer relentless consistency, suggests something underneath the performance. A woman who had been called a usurper and a homewrecker, and worse in the streets, was determined, it seems, to be remembered instead as a giver. Perhaps she had even persuaded herself that enough generosity might make her safe. Not everyone experienced her reforming zeal as generosity. In 1535, the machinery of the oath ground into the lives of two of the most respected men in England, and Anne, fairly or not, was seen as one of the hands on the lever. Sir Thomas More, the former Lord Chancellor, a scholar admired across Europe, and John Fisher, the aged Bishop of Rochester, both refused to swear that Henry was supreme head of the church, and both refused to accept that the king's marriage to Anne was lawful. Fisher had been Catherine's most devoted defender for years. More simply, would not put his soul on the line for an oath he did not believe. They were imprisoned in the Tower, and then, in the summer of 1535, within a fortnight of each other, they were beheaded on Tower Hill for it. All of Europe recoiled. These were not obscure heretics. These were famous, learned, pious men, and Henry had killed them for declining to endorse his second marriage. Anne did not order their deaths. That was Henry, and increasingly Cromwell, but she was the reason the oath existed to be refused, and she made no secret of her contempt for the men who defied it. The blood of Thomas More and John Fisher did not land on the popular image of Anne Boleyn as a sympathetic figure. It confirmed the image the crowds already had, of a woman for whose sake good men were dying. There was, too, the strange affair of the woman they called the Nun of Kent. Elizabeth Barton was a young servant girl who fell into trances and delivered prophecies, and who had built, over several years, a considerable popular following, being consulted by monks and gentlemen, and even, once, by Wolsey himself. So long as her visions were about the general state of men's souls, she was tolerated, even celebrated. But as the great matter dragged on, her prophecies grew pointed. She declared, in her trances, that if Henry set aside Catherine and married Anne, he would cease within months to be king, and would die a villain's death. That was a dangerous thing to be saying out loud to large crowds, while the king was doing exactly that. Barton and a circle of her supporters were arrested, made to confess that the visions had been fabricated, and in the spring of 1534 they were dragged to Tyburn and hanged. A prophet who had told the country that Anne Boleyn's marriage would destroy the king was executed for it. History has a grim sense of timing, and it would be another 2 years before anyone appreciated the joke. That white-crowned falcon on its blooming stump was carved and painted and stitched throughout the palaces now, and there is a small telling story about it. A courtier out hunting is supposed to have seen the Queen's badge, the falcon in its finery, set up beside the old badge of Catherine of Aragon, a pomegranate, and to have watched, or claimed to have watched, the Queen's people deface the pomegranate. Whether that particular incident happened as told hardly matters. The two badges were the whole quarrel in miniature. The pomegranate, ancient and Spanish and barren-looking now. The falcon, new and English and crowned, springing from a stump that was supposed to be putting out roses. Anne had chosen a badge that promised an heir, and hung it in every hall, and the longer she failed to deliver that heir, the more the badge began to look less like a promise, and more like a reproach that she had nailed to her own walls. In the summer of 1535, Henry and Anne went on a long progress through the west of England, moving from great house to great house in the way that Tudor courts did, partly for pleasure, partly to be seen by the country, partly to eat their hosts nearly into ruin. It was, by most accounts, a good progress, one of the better stretches of their marriage, and in early September the royal party arrived, for a few late summer days at a modest manor in Wiltshire called Wolf Hall, the family seat of Sir John Seymour, whose son served at court and whose pale, quiet, unremarkable daughter Jane was one of the Queen's own ladies-in-waiting. Nobody wrote down anything dramatic about those days. There was no reason to. Henry hunted the Seymours' park, was entertained under the Seymours' roof, and moved on. But the king had now slept beneath the roof of the family whose daughter would replace, and then help to kill, the woman riding at his side. Anne was there for all of it, and saw nothing worth remembering. That is the way these things almost always work. The trap closes so slowly, and from such an ordinary direction, that the person standing in it feels only the pleasant weather of a good September. Because underneath the patronage and the pageantry, the one thing that could actually secure her had not come. Sometime in the summer of 1534, Anne conceived again, and the court held its breath, and then, in the late summer or early autumn, the pregnancy ended. A miscarriage, or perhaps a stillbirth. The records are deliberately vague, because nobody wished to write down a failure of this kind in ink that might last. Anne withdrew to her chambers. Henry went hunting. The silence between them afterward was heavier than any quarrel would have been. When they came back together, something had shifted in him. Henry began to notice other women again, not in the grand, obsessive, world-altering way he had once noticed Anne, but in the casual, hungry manner of a king who had always taken what he pleased and was starting to feel that he had paid a great deal for this particular wife and was not getting his money's worth. There were rumours of a young woman at court who had caught his eye. The rumours reached Anne, and they lit something in her she could not put out. She raged. She wept. She confronted him in front of his own counsellors, her voice sharp and shaking, accusations spilling out of her before she could weigh a single one of them. And Henry, who had once found her fire the most exciting thing in England, now found it merely exhausting. He told her, coldly, that she should shut her eyes and endure, as her betters had done, meaning Catherine, who had endured his mistresses for 2 decades without a public word. And he reminded her, in a sentence that must have gone through her like cold water, that he could lower her just as quickly and easily as he had raised her. These scenes became a feature of the marriage. The courtiers learned to take a step back when the king and queen began to hiss at each other across a room. Some were embarrassed by it. Some were quietly delighted. The conservative faction, the men who had never accepted Anne or the break with Rome and had only been waiting, began to smell blood. And Anne's temper, which had once been an asset in a woman who had to fight for every inch of her place, was now a plain liability in a woman who was supposed, at last, to be secure, and was visibly not. The ordinary people of England had never warmed to her, and now their dislike hardened into something uglier and stranger. When she appeared in public, the crowds were thin and sullen. Words followed her that were meant to be overheard, and the rumours turned frankly monstrous. It was whispered that she had a 6th finger on one hand, the devil's mark, a sign of witchcraft. It was whispered that she had a great disfiguring wen on her throat, which she hid behind her high collars and her famous hood. None of it was true. That same Venetian ambassador, who owed her no flattery at all, had described a graceful neck and slender hands. But truth was not what the rumours were for. In the popular imagination, Anne had become less a bad queen than a kind of witch, a dark creature who had bewitched a good king and stolen the throne from a saintly one. And the saintly one was still alive, off in her damp exile, which meant Anne was never truly safe. Catherine of Aragon had been stripped of her title, banished from court, and shuffled between a series of cold, unhealthy country houses where her health failed slowly and her spirit hardened into something like stone. She still commanded enormous loyalty from the common people and from powerful men abroad, and her nephew the emperor made it quietly clear that any move to actually harm her would have consequences. Henry understood the limits, so Catherine lived on, banished but breathing, and as long as she breathed, there was a version of events in which Henry might tire of the whole Boleyn experiment and simply take his real wife back, which meant Anne's crown rested on Henry's continued belief in 2 things: that their marriage was valid and that she would give him a son. Neither of those pillars was as solid as it had once looked, and both of them were being watched closely by a man who had once been her ally. Thomas Cromwell, now the king's indispensable chief minister, had by this point moved decisively past the alliance he and Anne had once shared. The dissolution of the monasteries was beginning in earnest, and the great river of monastic wealth was starting to flow toward the crown, toward the treasury, toward the loyal men who could be bought with a grant of abbey lands, exactly as Cromwell had always intended and exactly as Anne had always opposed. She had not stopped opposing it. She had one of her chaplains preach a sermon in front of the king and the court on a text about a wicked royal counsellor who enriched himself and misled his master, and nobody in that chapel had the slightest doubt about whom the sermon was aimed at. It was a public shot across Cromwell's bow, from a queen who still believed she had the standing to fire it. Cromwell sat through it. Cromwell was very good at sitting through things, and he began, around this time, to think seriously about the fact that his own head might not be safe as long as Anne Boleyn had the king's ear, and to consider what might be done about that. In the last months of 1535, a fragile hope arrived. Anne was pregnant again. The familiar machinery started up once more, the prayers, the confident astrologers, the careful preparations that nobody would name out loud for fear of tempting fate. Anne told her women, with the flat certainty of someone who cannot afford to consider the alternative, that this time it would be a boy. Then, on the 7th of January, 1536, a rider came to Greenwich with news that reordered everything overnight. Catherine of Aragon was dead. She had died at Kimbolton Castle, in a cold bed, attended by a few faithful servants, having dictated a last letter to Henry in which she called him her most dear lord and husband, and begged him, at the end, to be a good father to their daughter Mary. She had refused, to her final breath, to surrender the title of Queen. Henry received the news with an eruption of pure relief. He is supposed to have cried out that now they were free from all threat of war. He ordered celebrations. He dressed himself and Anne head to foot in bright, defiant yellow, and paraded the little Elizabeth through the court in his arms for everyone to admire. Anne, at his side in her yellow gown, played the part of the triumphant queen to the hilt, but something cold and frightened was moving behind the performance, because she was clever enough to see what the death of Catherine had actually done. As long as Catherine lived, Henry could not easily be rid of Anne without facing the horror of taking Catherine back, a woman he loathed by now, and whose nephew commanded armies. That was the one thing that had made Anne, in a strange way, protected. And now that protection was in a coffin, being carried toward a grave at Peterborough. For the first time, Henry was a widower. If his second marriage could somehow be made to disappear, there was no first wife waiting in the wings to complicate it. He was, in the cold arithmetic of royal marriage, free, and Anne was carrying the child she believed would save her. The pregnancy was well advanced now, past the most dangerous early months. She withdrew from the public gaze, resting, conserving her strength, willing her own body to do the single thing that mattered more than everything she had ever built. Toward the end of January, the pains began too early. She was rushed to her chamber. The midwives were called. The court fell silent and waited. And then, in a rush of blood, it was over. She had miscarried. The child was far enough along that its sex could be told, and the word that travelled from the midwives to the counsellors to the king was the cruelest one available. It had been a boy, a son perhaps 15 or 16 weeks along, formed and finished and dead, and she had lost him, by the reckoning of the time, on the very day that Catherine of Aragon was being lowered into the ground. Henry came to her bedside. The room was dark and close, thick with the smell of blood and the bitter herbs the physicians had burned. Anne lay white against the pillows. What passed between them is known only through the recollections of attendants who stood too far off to catch every word, but the shape of it came down to us, and it is chilling. Henry told her that he saw now that God would not grant him sons by her. He reminded her, as though she needed reminding, that he had lifted her up out of nothing. He told her his conscience was troubled. He spoke to his grieving wife not as a husband but as a king reviewing a failed policy, and then he turned around and left the room. Anne is supposed to have said from the bed that the loss was his fault, that it was grief over his carrying on with other women that had shaken the child loose. Maybe she did say it. It would have been true, and it would have been exactly the wrong thing to say, and saying the true and fatal thing out loud had always been the most dangerous habit she had. The miscarriage of that January was the hinge on which the whole life turned. Before it, Anne was a queen in difficulty, struggling, quarrelling, making enemies, but still the anointed wife, still under the king's protection, still the mother of a legitimate heir. After it, she was something else. She was a failed investment. She was a woman standing between Henry and the future he had already begun, in the privacy of his own head, to picture without her. That future had a name, and the name was Jane Seymour. She had been at court for some time, a quiet, unremarkable presence among Anne's own ladies, the same pale girl whose family manor the court had visited the previous September. Fair-haired, soft-spoken, gentle-mannered, Jane was, point for point, everything Anne was not. Submissive where Anne was sharp, conventional where Anne was foreign, silent where Anne could never quite learn to be. She came of respectable Wiltshire gentry, and she had absorbed early the one lesson Anne had never managed to learn, that a woman in the orbit of Henry VIII should make herself small, agreeable, and impossible to feel threatened by. She rarely raised her voice. She offered no opinions. She lowered her eyes and blushed on cue. Henry's pursuit of her through the early months of 1536 was not subtle, and it was cruelly designed to be seen. He sent her gifts. He seated her near him. There is a story, and it has the ring of truth, that he sent Jane a purse of gold coins with a letter, and that Jane, coached by her ambitious brothers and by the conservative faction now gathering behind her, sent the purse back unopened, kissed the letter, and returned it unread, saying that she was a gentlewoman of good family, that she had nothing in the world but her honour, and that if the king wished to give her money he might do so when God sent her a good marriage. It was, of course, exactly the move Anne herself had made a decade earlier. Henry, who had fallen in love once already with a woman who would not simply lie down for him, fell for the same play a second time, apparently without ever once noticing that he was watching the same performance. That is the sort of thing a fond narrator is not supposed to find funny, and I try not to, and I fail, because it is grimly funny the most powerful man in Europe, undone twice by the identical trick and never the wiser. Anne saw all of it. She confronted Henry. She confronted Jane. She wept and raged and made scenes, and every scene pushed him further away and made the contrast between the two women sharper. Anne, with her fierce intelligence and her fear so plainly visible, Jane with her downcast eyes and her perfect, patient stillness. Anne tried, that spring, to fight the only way she knew. She dressed with extra care. She staged entertainments. She brought little Elizabeth to court and set her in front of Henry, hoping the sight of their bright, red-haired girl might reach something in him. He was polite. He was distant. He had already decided, somewhere behind those small, cold eyes, and Henry VIII, once he had truly decided a thing, was a man capable of very nearly anything. Thomas Cromwell, watching from his offices, reached the same conclusion the king had, and set about solving the king's problem in the way that would also solve his own. Anne was finished. The only question was how to remove her without leaving a mess. A second annulment would be humiliating and would raise awkward questions about the first. Sending her to a convent would leave a dangerous, articulate, well-connected loose end alive and talking. The cleanest solution, the one that would free Henry completely, allow Cromwell to make his peace with the triumphant Seymour party, and put an end to the Queen's meddling in monastic wealth all at once, was the one that had never yet been used against an anointed Queen of England, death. But it had to be legal, or legal enough to hold up in front of 2,000 watching people and a dozen foreign ambassadors. So Cromwell began, quietly and with his usual patience, to build a case out of the ordinary materials of a royal court. He watched the young men who came and went from the Queen's rooms, the musicians, the gentlemen of the privy chamber, the courtiers who flirted and flattered and wrote bad poetry to a queen because flirting with the queen was a courtly game everyone played and no one meant. In a household full of young, ambitious men and a queen famous for her wit, there was always raw material, and Cromwell was a master at turning the ordinary into the damning. Toward the end of April, a young musician named Mark Smeaton was detained and taken to a house in Stepney for questioning. Smeaton was low-born, gifted, vain, and utterly without protection, no family at court, no great patron, nobody who would raise a finger if he simply disappeared. He was exactly the sort of person Cromwell's machine was designed to break, and it broke him. Under interrogation, almost certainly under some form of torture, though the official record is careful never to say so, Smeaton confessed that he had been the Queen's lover. It was a lie, squeezed out of a terrified young man who would have said the sky was green to make it stop, but it was the first brick, and once it was laid, the rest of the wall could be built on top of it. Anne, in her rooms at Greenwich, knew none of this. She was still trying to navigate the daily humiliations of her collapsing position, still half believing she could claw her way back into her husband's favour if she could only find the right thing to say. The last days of that April were, from where she sat, almost ordinary. She played with Elizabeth, she spoke with her chaplains, she slept badly and lay awake in the early hours, and the floor beneath her had already given way, and she could not yet feel it. On the 30th of April, the last pretence of an ordinary marriage shattered in the open. Anne and Henry were at Greenwich, and the argument that broke between them was heard by servants in the next room and courtiers in the corridor, and anyone close enough to catch the sharp edges of two voices cutting through the afternoon. Anne had Elizabeth with her, a red-haired child of 2.5, and there is an account, unbearable to picture, in which she stood in a courtyard below the king's open window and held the little girl up toward him, pleading, not for herself now, but for the child they had made together. Henry looked down at her and said nothing anyone could later repair, and turned from the window. Whatever exactly passed between them, it was the end. He rode for London that evening and did not say goodbye to her, and she never saw him again. The next morning was the 1st of May, a day of old celebration, and the court had gathered at Greenwich for the traditional May Day jousts. The lists were dressed with banners. Henry was in his element, surrounded by his knights and the roar of the crowd and the thunder of the horses. Anne sat in the royal gallery, dressed for the occasion, her face composed, watching her own brother George and the king's close friend Henry Norris ride against each other in the tournament below. She knew something was wrong, the argument of the day before, the strange currents in the household, the faces that would not meet her eye, but she did not yet know its shape. As the jousting went on, a messenger reached the king, and he read or heard something, and his whole manner changed. He rose abruptly. He left the tournament without a single word to his queen, and rode away toward London with a small, hard-faced group of companions, and among the men riding at his side, being questioned as they went, was Henry Norris himself. Anne was left sitting in the gallery with the jousts continuing beneath her, and the eyes of the court sliding toward her and away. A queen does not flee a public spectacle, so she stayed in her seat until she could leave with dignity, and then she went back to her apartments, and she did not sleep. The rhythm of the palace had gone wrong. Guards stood where guards had not stood before. In the early hours of the 2nd of May, the door to her chambers opened, and the men she least wished to see came through it. She was arrested. The charges were read to her: adultery with several men, incest with her own brother, and conspiring with her lovers to bring about the death of the king. Treason of every kind the law could name. Anne listened. She did not collapse. She asked to see the king, and was told it was impossible. She asked whether she would be taken to the Tower, and was told that she would. They took her by barge, down the Thames, on the same broad grey river she had travelled in triumph, almost exactly 3 years before, on her way to be crowned. You are in a covered barge on the river you know better than any road in England, and the oars are dipping and rising, and the same banks are sliding past that slid past on the brightest morning of your life. You went up this water once under a canopy of cloth of gold, to the sound of guns fired in your honour and a mechanical dragon breathing flame. You are going down it now under guard, and the guns are silent, and the tower is rising out of the haze ahead of you, and you have stayed inside its walls before in the royal apartments, the ones they prepare for a monarch on the night before a coronation. You understand, watching the Watergate grow larger, that you are going back to those same rooms, not as a queen the night before her crowning, as a prisoner the fortnight before her death. And the terrible symmetry of it, the fact that it is the same river and the same fortress and very likely the same rooms, is a thing your clever mind cannot stop turning over, no matter how much you would give to make it stop. When the barge landed and Anne climbed out onto the cobbles, the constable of the tower, Sir William Kingston, was waiting to receive her. He was a seasoned soldier who had seen a great many frightened people come through that gate, and he was not a cruel man. He treated her with careful formality, addressing her still as the Queen, even though the charges laid against her denied that she had any right to the name. She was taken up into the royal lodgings, the very rooms she had occupied on the night before her coronation, 3 years and 11 months earlier, and she understood exactly where she was. She sank to her knees on the stone floor and asked Kingston whether she was to be put in a dungeon. He told her no, she would have the Queen's own lodgings. She laughed at that strange, cracked sound and said that it was too good for her. Then she asked whether her father was taken and whether her brother was taken. And Kingston, who had his orders, would not answer. And she asked whether she was to die, and he told her only that the poorest subject the king had was in God's hands, and so was she. What followed were the strangest days of Anne Boleyn's life, and they are documented more intimately than almost any other stretch of her existence, because William Kingston was required to write to Cromwell and report everything the Queen said and did. Those letters survive, damaged and incomplete, but astonishing the voice of a woman in the grip of mortal terror, trying to make sense of the senseless, written down by a jailer who was also, in the strange intimacy of those rooms, something close to her last confidant. In the first hours she was frantic, talking without stopping, veering from terror to wild laughter, to prayer and back to terror. She asked after the men. She asked where Norris was, and Weston, and Brereton. She asked, over and over, whether her brother George had been taken, and Kingston noted the particular fear in the question, because George had indeed been taken, and was somewhere in the same fortress, arrested on the charge of having committed incest with his own sister. The word itself seemed to hang between them, too large and too foul to be real. At other moments she was almost giddy, with the giddiness of extreme fear. She made a grim joke that ran around the tower and eventually out into the city and down into the chronicles that she would be easy to nickname now Queen Anne Lackhead, because the sword would take her cleanly and she would suffer only a moment. She put her hands around her own throat and laughed when she said it. Kingston, watching her, wrote that the lady had much joy and pleasure in death, and it is plain from his account that what he was really watching was a mind trying to rob the thing of its power by naming it out loud again and again. She talked, unstoppably, about the men, and in doing so she handed the prosecution some of its best material without meaning to. She told the story of a conversation she had once had with Henry Norris. She had asked him, teasingly, why he did not go ahead and marry the woman he was courting, and Norris had given some evasive answer about being in no hurry, and Anne, exasperated, had snapped at him that he must be waiting for dead men's shoes, that if any harm came to the king, Norris would look to have her. It was a reckless, stupid thing to have said even in jest, because it put into words the one idea the whole indictment turned on, that the Queen and her circle imagined a world in which the king was dead. She knew, even as she recounted it to Kingston, how it would be used. She could not seem to stop herself from telling it anyway. The arrests widened. Sir Francis Weston, young, handsome, charming, a favourite at court, was taken. So was William Brereton, a wealthy and hard gentleman of Cheshire, with a long list of enemies who found his removal convenient. The Poot, Thomas Wyatt, was taken too, Though Wyatt, who had loved Anne years before and written poems about her that everyone could read the meaning of, would in the end be released without ever standing trial, protected by Cromwell for reasons of his own, the pattern in all of it was becoming clear. This was not simply about proving the Queen an adulteress. It was about sweeping up, in one motion, the men around her, whose removal happened to suit the new order. The cruelest stroke was reserved for her brother. The charge against George Boleyn was not merely that he had been too familiar with his sister or spent too long alone in her company. It was incest, plainly stated that the Queen had drawn her own brother into her bed, that they had done the unspeakable together, and that George might even be the father of one of the children she had lost. The accusation was monstrous, and it was meant to be monstrous, because Cromwell understood the mechanics of belief perfectly. An ordinary accusation of adultery with a musician might be doubted, but an accusation so grotesque, so far outside the bounds of anything a normal person would do, might make Anne seem not merely sinful but unnatural, a creature outside the human pale, and if the public could be brought to believe that of her, they would believe anything else that was said. George Boleyn was 27, bright, cultivated, a poet and a diplomat, and his sister's closest ally in all the world, and now he was to be dragged onto the same scaffold as a means of destroying her more completely. At some point in those first days, a letter was supposedly written from the Tower to the King. In Anne's name, a letter of extraordinary pride and desperation, protesting her innocence, reminding Henry of everything they had been to each other, asking only for a fair and open trial, and begging him, if he was determined to be rid of her, at least to spare the innocent men caught in the net beside her. Whether Anne truly wrote it, historians have argued for centuries, and the original does not survive. But whoever composed it, it was never answered. She looked around the court she had ruled, and found that it had emptied around her. The friends of her triumph had melted away. The reformers she had raised up kept their heads low. The courtiers who had flattered her a month before were already learning the shortest route to Jane Seymour's rooms. Even her own uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, the greatest of the Howards, the man who would preside over her trial, even he had made it plain that he would do his duty to the king before he did anything at all for his niece. Anne had always known, in theory, that blood counted for less than survival. Learning it in theory and living it inside a stone cell were not the same thing. The men were tried first, on the 12th of May, and that order was not an accident. Norris, Weston, Brereton, and Smeaton, the four commoners, were arraigned together in Westminster Hall before the trial of the Queen and her brother, because if the men were convicted of adultery with her, then her guilt was already established before she ever entered a courtroom. She would be tried for a crime that a jury had, in effect, already ruled had happened. It was an elegant piece of legal engineering, and it worked exactly as designed. Smeaton, who had confessed, pleaded guilty. The other three, Norris, the king's old friend, Weston, the golden young courtier, Brereton, the tough Cheshire man, all pleaded not guilty and denied everything. It made no difference. There was a story, afterward, that Weston's wealthy family offered an enormous sum for his life, and that foreign merchants added to it, and that the offer went as high as a fortune, and that it was refused, because these men were not being tried to be spared. All four were condemned to the traitor's death. The verdict against them sealed the verdict against Anne 2 days before her trial began. On the morning of the 15th of May, the door of her lodging opened, and she was told it was time. Her trial and her brother's were held not in Westminster but inside the Tower itself, in the great hall, the same vast room where she had dined in state on the night before her coronation, when these walls had been hung for a queen. Now the hall had been rebuilt into a courtroom, with a high platform for the judges and rows of benches for the spectators, and some 2,000 people had been admitted to watch nobles, officials, foreign ambassadors, a carefully chosen audience who would carry the story of what they saw back out into the world. The man who presided was her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, one of the most powerful men in England and a survivor of every political storm of the age, and he had no intention of risking his own neck for a niece who had already lost. He sat at the centre of the platform, his face giving away nothing. and he called the court to order. The indictment was read aloud, and it was a document of staggering scope and lurid specific detail. Anne was accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother. It listed dates and places and named the palaces where the Queen was said to have taken each of them to her bed. It claimed she had mocked the king with her lovers, laughed at his verses and his manhood, promised to marry one of them when he was dead, and conspired with them to hasten that death. It was a tower of accusation built brick on brick, and to anyone who actually knew the Queen's movements, the dates were impossible. Several of the assignations were placed on days when Anne was demonstrably somewhere else entirely, in one case still confined to her bed recovering from childbirth, in another in full public view of the whole court for hours. The men who drew up the indictment had not troubled themselves with a calendar. They had not needed to. Anne was brought in wearing black, simple and severe, her dark hair drawn back, her face pale from a fortnight in the Tower, but her back straight and her eyes clear. She had no lawyer. In a Tudor treason trial, the accused was allowed none. She had to answer, alone, a panel of 26 peers of the realm, every last one of them chosen for the purpose, every last one of them either her enemy or too frightened to appear as anything but her enemy. And she defended herself. The eyewitnesses in that hall, including several who had no love for her at all, recorded that she answered the charges with a clarity and composure that visibly unsettled the room. She spoke calmly. She denied each accusation in turn. When the words she had spoken to Norris about dead men's shoes were thrown at her, she explained them for what they had been: a foolish, idle, exasperated joke, not a plot. When the charge of adultery with the servant Smeaton was read, she pointed out that she had exchanged only a handful of words with him in her life, and never once been alone with him, and that she could not account for his confession except that he must have been terrified or tortured into it, which was exactly the truth. And when the charge of incest with her brother was put to her, she did not waver for an instant. She said, loudly enough for the whole hall to hear, that these things were lies, and she answered them so clearly and with such presence of mind that observers wrote afterward that had the verdict depended on the evidence, she would have walked free. But the verdict did not depend on the evidence. It had been settled before she entered the room. George Boleyn was tried immediately after his sister, and he defended himself with the same cool skill, so ably that men in the hall began, quietly, to lay bets that he would be acquitted. And then the prosecution played a card, in the most literal sense. There was a piece of evidence they did not wish to read aloud, and so it was written on a slip of paper and handed to George with instructions to read it silently and confine his answer to yes or no. It concerned a thing his wife was said to have reported, that Anne had told her that the king was not able to satisfy a woman, that he had neither the vigour nor the skill. It was doubly dangerous. It suggested the Queen and her circle gossiped about the king's failures in bed, and it hinted at the unspeakable idea that Elizabeth might not be Henry's at all. George Boleyn looked at the paper, and then, deliberately, knowing precisely what it would cost him, he read the words out loud to the entire hall. It was an act of defiance from a man who understood he was going to die regardless, and had decided he would not help them hide their own filth. It changed nothing about his sentence. It was, in its way, magnificent. The peers withdrew and did not stay away long. When they returned, each man stood in turn and gave his verdict, one after another down the long rows. Guilty, guilty, guilty. 26 voices, the same single word, unanimous. Among them, forced to pronounce it with the rest, was Henry Percy, the same Henry Percy who, a dozen years before, had secretly promised to marry her before the cardinal broke them apart. He is said to have been so overcome as the trial went on that he had to be helped from the hall. He gave his guilty verdict all the same. Anne received it standing, in her black gown, without a tear. She did not protest. She simply stood and let the Duke of Norfolk pronounce the sentence, and her uncle, reading the law aloud, wept as he did it, or came close to it. The punishment for a woman convicted of high treason was to be burned alive at the stake, or, if the king in his mercy preferred, to be beheaded. Which of the two it would be was left, deliberately, to Henry. When she was allowed to speak, Anne said, in effect, that she was prepared to die, but that she was sorry other innocent and loyal people would die because of her. Then she was taken back to her lodging to wait, and the wait was 5 days. Henry chose the sword. It was presented as mercy, and in the narrowest sense it was a clean stroke instead of the horror of the fire, or even the ordinary butchery of the axe, which in unskilled hands could take 3 or 4 blows. But it was also, characteristically, a matter of managing the picture. Henry sent to Calais for a professional headsman who worked with a heavy 2-handed sword rather than a block and axe, a man reputed to be swift and exact. And here is the detail that tells you everything about how much of a trial this trial had really been. The swordsman of Calais was summoned before the verdict was ever handed down. The order went out while Anne was still, technically, only accused. The instrument of her death was already crossing the channel while she was defending her life in her uncle's courtroom. The men died first. On the 17th of May, on Tower Hill, George Boleyn and the 4 others were beheaded one after another. George first, given the small dignity of going before the men accused of adultery with his sister. Not far away, shut in the bell tower, the poet Thomas Wyatt watched the executions through a window. He had known most of these men. He had loved the woman they were dying for. And he wrote, out of that window and those days, some of the bleakest lines in the English language about the sudden violence that lives close to a throne, about a bloody time that had broken his heart, and about the way the thunder rolls around the crown, and about the men he had seen who once stood so high and now were gone. Wyatt lived. He was let out, quietly, some weeks later, but he never wrote about the spring of 1536 as anything other than a wound. That same day, the 17th of May, Thomas Cromwell came to the Tower. He did not come to comfort Anne, though he may have wished to. He came to dissolve her marriage. In a small private ceremony, with Anne present, the Archbishop of Canterbury pronounced that the union between Henry and Anne was, and always had been, null and void. The precise grounds were never made public. The document has been lost or was destroyed. But the likeliest reason is a bitter one, that Henry's earlier affair with Anne's sister Mary had created, in the eyes of church law, an impediment of affinity. The very same kind of impediment he had spent 7 years arguing had made his marriage to Catherine invalid. If that was the ground, then the logic was savage and complete. If Henry's relationship with Mary made his marriage to Anne void, then Anne had never truly been his wife, had never truly been Queen, and Elizabeth, the bright red-haired girl at Hatfield, was a bastard. Cranmer, of all the men in this story, is the one whose position I find hardest to sit with, because he was not a monster, and he did not want to do any of this. Anne had made him. She had lifted him from a Cambridge fellowship to the highest office in the English Church. He owed her his career and, in a real sense, his whole life's work, the Reformed Church he believed in. And when she fell, he wrote to Henry a letter that is an almost unbearable thing to read. A letter that tries, in the same breath, to be loyal to his king and just to his friend. He wrote that he was clean amazed, that he had never had a better opinion of any woman than of her, and that next to the king himself, he was more bound to her than to any creature living, and that he could not, in his heart, believe her guilty. And then, having said all that, he bent, as everyone in this story bent, and did what the king required, and dissolved the marriage of the woman to whom he owed everything, 2 days before she died. He kept his opinion of her innocence, and he kept his head, and he had to live the rest of his long life knowing the price of keeping both. Anne received the news of the annulment, and that, at last, was the thing that broke through her composure. She had held herself together through the arrest, the imprisonment, the trial, the verdict, the sentence. But the knowledge that her daughter was being stripped of her title, that Elizabeth would grow up branded a bastard, that the one child she had fought so hard and so publicly to protect was being cast down, that reached a place nothing else had reached. She wept. Kingston recorded that she wept for her daughter and said the girl was a princess born, and that none could take that from her, But they could take it. They had taken it. Elizabeth was no longer a princess, and Anne was no longer a wife, and there was nothing left to fight for except the manner of her ending. And once there was nothing left to fight for, a strange calm came back to her. The worst had already happened. She asked for the Blessed Sacrament to be kept in her chamber so that she could pray before it, and she did something that mattered enormously to her, and that ought to matter to us. In the presence of Kingston, she received the sacrament and swore on that sacrament on the damnation of her own soul twice, once before receiving, and once after that she had never been unfaithful to the king. For a believing woman of the 16th century, that oath, sworn on the body of Christ at the very edge of death, was the most binding thing a human being could do. To swear it falsely was to choose hell, deliberately, with your last free act. She swore it knowing there was no earthly court left to hear the appeal, no judge who would reverse a thing, no king who would ride to save her. She swore it because it was true, and because she wanted the truth to exist somewhere in the record, even if not one soul alive that week believed it. The execution was set for the morning of the 19th of May, inside the walls of the Tower, on the green before the chapel, not the public killing ground of Tower Hill where the crowds jeered at common traitors, but a smaller, quieter place, reserved for prisoners of rank whose deaths the king did not want, turned into a spectacle he could not control. There was a delay of a day. The first date passed, and Kingston reported that the Queen was distressed by the postponement, not because she feared death, but because she had steeled herself for it and wished it done. She had, she said, thought to be dead by now and past her pain. She was ready before they were. She spent her last night in prayer, with her almoner and the 4 women who had been assigned to attend her through the whole ordeal, and who had become, in the strange closeness of the cell, her final companions in the world. It is the short hours before dawn on your last morning, and you have been awake a long time, and you are not, in the end, afraid the way you thought you would be. You have made your confession. You have sworn your innocence on the body of your God, which is the last true thing you have left to give, and you have given it. Your women are moving quietly in the dark, weeping when they think you cannot hear. In a few hours they will dress you, and you have already chosen what you will wear, because you were never once in your life careless about what you wore, and you are not going to start now, at the end. You think about the girl at Hatfield who does not yet know, who is too young to hold any of this, who will grow up being told that her mother was a monster. And you decide, lying there in the dark, the single most important thing you will decide all morning, that whatever you say on that scaffold, in front of those witnesses, you will say nothing at all, that could ever be used to hurt her. The light came early on the 19th, pale and thin through the narrow windows. Her women dressed her with the care she had asked for. She put on a petticoat of red, the colour of blood, and, in the old faith, the colour of martyrdom, a quiet statement for anyone with the eyes to read it. Over it went a gown of dark grey damask trimmed with fur, and over her hair that famous French hood, the one that had scandalised and delighted the English court 15 years earlier, the one that had marked her from the first day as different, as foreign, as herself. She wore no great jewels. She did not need them. Kingston came for her at 8 o'clock. He found her composed, standing in the middle of the room, her women weeping behind her. She asked him whether it would hurt. He told her the swordsman of Calais was very skilled, and that it would be over in a moment. She put her hands to her own throat, and she said that she had heard he was very good, and that she had only a little neck, and she laughed, not the cracked, frantic laughter of her first days in the Tower. Something lighter than that, almost easy, the laughter of a woman who had finished being afraid. The walk to the green was short, a few hundred paces, and it took her past the small chapel of St. Peter, where the bodies of the executed were laid beneath the stones. She would have known she would be inside it within the hour, not as a worshipper but as a body waiting for the floor to be lifted. She did not pause. She kept walking. On the green a low scaffold had been built and draped in black, with fresh straw scattered to take the blood. A crowd of perhaps 1,000 had been let in by invitation nobles, city officials, the Lord Mayor of London, foreign diplomats who would write it all down for their masters. Cromwell was there. The common people of London, the same ones who had stood silent at her coronation, were on the far side of the walls. The swordsman waited, dressed not in a butcher's apron but in plain, sober clothes, and his weapon was hidden in the straw at his feet, out of her sight, so that she would not have to look at it. Anne climbed the steps and turned to face them all, and by every account that survives, she was calm. She asked leave to speak, and it was granted, and the crowd fell quiet. Her speech was brief, no more than a few sentences, and every word of it had been weighed. She did not argue with the sentence. She did not protest her innocence, not there, not on the scaffold, because she knew that a dying woman's accusation against the king, spoken in front of 2,000 ears, would fall on her daughter's head within the week. So she said, instead, that she had come there to die, as she was condemned by the law, and that she would accuse no one and speak against nothing. She asked the crowd to pray for the king, and she called him the man who had built this scaffold for her, a good and gentle and sovereign lord, as merciful a prince as there ever was. It was a lie. Everyone on that green knew it was a lie, and she told it anyway, on purpose, with her last minutes, because she had a 2-year-old daughter who would have to live in this man's kingdom, and a curse from the scaffold was a luxury a mother could not afford. She commended her soul to God and asked the onlookers for their prayers, and she was finished. Her women came forward, weeping, to take her hood and her gown. She gave them over the way a person hands things to a maid at the end of an ordinary evening, and she tucked her hair up under a small linen cap so that her neck was bare. She knelt in the straw. She would not be blindfolded at first, and someone tied the cloth for her, and now the swordsman did a merciful and terrible thing. Knowing she would flinch if she saw the blow coming, he called out loudly, to a boy, to no one, to draw her eyes asking for his sword, though the sword was already in his hands, so that in the last instant her head would turn the other way. You are kneeling in the straw with your eyes bound, and you can feel the morning air on the back of your bare neck, and you are saying the words over and over, the only words left, the ones you decided on in the dark. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. And you hear a voice call out somewhere to your right, and your head turns a little toward it, without your deciding to, the way a head does, and that is the last thing, the turning of your head toward a voice, and you never feel the rest. It was one stroke. The witnesses closest to the scaffold said her lips were still moving in prayer for a moment after. Then the women rushed forward with a white cloth to cover what was left, because no one had thought to provide a coffin for a Queen of England. An attendant found an old elm chest that had been used to store arrows, long and narrow, and Anne Boleyn's body was folded into it, and her head laid beside it, and the chest was carried the short distance to the chapel of St. Peter, and buried under the stone floor near the altar, without a service, without a marker, without her name. On the wall of the tower, a single cannon fired, the signal to the king that it was done. Henry, who had spent that morning at his other palace, heard the distant gun and, the story goes, called for his dogs and rode out hunting. He was already dressed for a wedding. He would be betrothed to Jane Seymour the next day and married to her inside a fortnight. Anne Boleyn was gone, 1,036 days after that silent coronation. But a life does not stop mattering at the moment the body stops, and Anne had left something behind that would outlast every single person who condemned her. Her daughter was at Hatfield, too young to understand any of it. The servants would have kept the news from her as long as they could, but a child of 2.5 knows when the ground has shifted. Overnight, the household of the Princess Elizabeth became the household of the Lady Elizabeth, a bastard, a girl with no title and an uncertain future. There is a small, sharp story from those weeks, her governess writing in some distress to Cromwell to ask what the child was to wear, because Elizabeth had outgrown her clothes and nobody, now, was sure who was responsible for buying her more. The girl who had been the heir of England was, for a season, a problem of unpaid laundry. She kept being educated, because the Tudors believed in educating even their inconvenient children. But the tutors noticed a change come over her as she grew. She became watchful. She learned to guard her tongue and to keep her real thoughts behind her face, the same armor her mother had built in France at almost the same age, for almost the same reason. Henry moved on with unseemly speed. He married Jane Seymour 11 days after the sword fell, in a quiet ceremony, and Jane gave him, at last, the thing Anne had died for failing to give a son, Edward, born in the autumn of 1537. And then, 12 days after that birth, Jane Seymour died of childbed fever, and Henry, who had discarded 2 wives without a backward glance, mourned this one genuinely and deeply, and asked, years later, to be buried beside her, and was. The quiet one, the one who never raised her voice, is the wife whose grave he chose to share. Thomas Cromwell, who had built the machine that killed Anne, enjoyed his victory for 4 years. He was made Earl of Essex. He completed the dissolution of the monasteries and grew immensely rich on it. And then he arranged Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, a match the king found so distasteful that it lasted 6 months and curdled into a lasting grudge against the man who had made it. In the summer of 1540, Cromwell was arrested on charges of treason and heresy and taken to the same tower where Anne had spent her last days. He wrote frantic letters to Henry begging for mercy, protesting his loyalty, exactly as Anne had done and exactly to the same effect. He was beheaded on Tower Hill in July, and by an ugly accident, or perhaps a deliberate cruelty, the axeman assigned to him was clumsy, and it took several blows, a far messier death than the clean French sword he had arranged for the woman he destroyed. The chroniclers noticed the symmetry, and did not bother to hide their satisfaction at it. There is one more turn of that particular wheel. Jane Parker, Lady Rochford, George Boleyn's widow, had given evidence that helped send her husband and sister-in-law to the block some of the poison about what Anne had supposedly said of the king's manhood is thought to have come through her. She lived on and rose again and became a lady-in-waiting to Henry's 5th wife, the young Catherine Howard, who was, as it happened, another of Anne Boleyn's cousins. And when Catherine Howard fell in 1542 on charges of adultery that this time were probably true, Lady Rochford fell with her for helping to arrange the young queen's secret meetings. She was executed on Tower Green, on the same spot where Anne had died 6 years before. The 2 Boleyn cousins, the 2 beheaded queens, lie near each other now under the same chapel floor. Thomas Boleyn, the father who had sent his clever daughter into the courts of Europe and watched her climb higher than he could ever have dreamed, and then watched her and his son destroyed in a single week, withdrew from public life and died in 1539, his great project in ruins. Elizabeth Howard, Anne's mother, had died the year before. Neither of them lived to see what became of the granddaughter left behind at Hatfield. Because Elizabeth survived, that is the astonishing fact at the centre of all of it. The girl declared a bastard at 2 years old lived through her father's remaining marriages, through the short reign of her half-brother Edward, through the reign of her half-sister Mary, who imprisoned her for a time in the very tower where their father's quarrels had killed Anne Elizabeth is supposed to have refused, at first, to enter through the Watergate, and to have sat down on the wet steps in the rain rather than walk in like a traitor. She survived that too. And in November of 1558, when Mary died childless, and the crown came down at last to the final Tudor standing, Elizabeth Boleyn's daughter became Elizabeth I, Queen of England, 25 years old. Her reign lasted 44 years. It gave the language Shakespeare and Marlowe. It defeated the Spanish Armada. It turned a damp, second-rate island kingdom into something the rest of Europe had to take seriously. And the woman who did all of that was the furious red-haired infant whose birth had been such a bitter disappointment that her father cancelled the tournament. And she carried her mother with her, quietly, all her life. She almost never spoke of Anne in public. To have done so would have meant admitting that her own father had murdered an innocent woman, and the whole Tudor claim rested on the fiction that Henry was never wrong, but she wore a ring, a beautiful locket ring, that opened to show 2 tiny portraits inside. One was of Elizabeth herself, the other, facing it, was of a dark-haired woman that historians are all but certain is Anne Boleyn. The Queen of England wore her disgraced, beheaded mother against her hand, in secret, for decades, and told almost no one. She promoted the surviving Boleyn relatives, brought them close, favoured the descendants of Mary Boleyn. She kept the memory alive in 100 small, unspoken ways, without ever once saying the thing out loud. Other traces of Anne survived the deliberate campaign to erase her. Her portraits were taken down and destroyed after her death, so thoroughly that we cannot now say with certainty what she truly looked like. The famous image, the dark-haired woman in the French hood with the gold bee at her throat, is a copy of a copy, painted long after she was dead, an impression rather than a likeness. Her badges were chiselled off the palace walls, and yet a little book of hours that she is said to have carried came down through the centuries, with a line of verse she once wrote in it in her own hand, in the days when she and Henry were still passing love notes back and forth across a chapel. And in 1876, during repairs to the chapel of St. Peter inside the tower, workmen lifted the stones near the altar and found a jumble of bones, and among them the remains of a slender woman, buried without ceremony in exactly the place the records said Anne had been thrown. The Victorians who examined them concluded, on the evidence, that they had found her. They reburied her properly this time, under a marked stone with her name cut into it. If you go to the chapel today, you can stand over that small square of floor and know that what is left of her is finally, at least, named. The verdict of history, after 5 centuries of argument, is not really in doubt anymore. Anne Boleyn was innocent of the crimes that killed her. The adultery, the incest, the plot against the king, all of it was manufactured, on impossible dates, out of a confession squeezed from a tortured boy and a few reckless words spoken in jest. She was the victim of a political killing, engineered by Thomas Cromwell and signed off by a king who wanted a different wife and a living son. She was not a saint. She could be sharp, imperious, vindictive, and disastrously careless with her tongue. She made enemies faster than anyone could count and forgave them slowly, if at all. And men she despised went to their deaths for defying an oath she had helped to create. All of that is true, and a fond narrator does her no honour by pretending otherwise. But none of it made her a traitor, and none of it made her an adulteress, and she did not deserve to die on a spring morning with a borrowed sword at her throat. What she leaves behind is not a lesson. It is a set of specific, stubborn facts, and I'll give them to you plainly and let them be what they are. She refused, for 6 years, to be a king's mistress, and in refusing she changed the religion of a nation. She put a banned book into the hands of the most powerful man in England and pointed him at Rome. She was crowned in silence and buried in an arrow chest. She was the mother of the greatest ruler her country ever produced, and she never knew it and never got to see a minute of it because she was dead at somewhere between 29 and 36 years old, and we still cannot agree which. And she has been arguing with us about the details of her own life from the far side of the grave for 500 years. There is a story the tower guards still tell, on quiet evenings, after the visitors have gone and the ravens have settled, and the last light is leaving the river. They say the place has its ghosts, and that one of them is a woman in a grey gown who walks the corridor where the royal lodgings used to stand, and that she does not scream and does not weep, but only walks, over and over, the short path from the rooms where she prayed to the green where she knelt. I don't know whether to believe in such things, but I know that if any life in English history earned the right to refuse to stay quietly buried, to keep walking that same short path in the dark and daring the living to look at her and say what they did, it is this one. She kept her word on the scaffold. She said nothing that could hurt her daughter, and her daughter lived and reigned and wore her mother's face in a ring against her hand for 44 years. That is the part I keep coming back to, not the crown and not the sword. A woman deciding, in the dark, in her last free hours, that the last thing she would do with her life was protect a 2-year-old, and then doing it, perfectly, in front of 2,000 people, with a lie she chose on purpose. That was the last thing she was ever able to give anyone, and she gave it, and it worked. The night has grown deep around us now. The fire has burned low. You have walked with her all the way from the ducks on the moat at Hever to the glittering courts of Burgundy and France, to the silence of a coronation, to the silence of a scaffold. You have seen her rise and fall, love and lose, win everything and then lose all of it in a single spring. There is nothing left of the story to tell, so you can let her rest now,